That's over. Okay, we're going to start now. We had two questions last week. The first one had to do with the use of do versus, to versus for. And the original question was, is there a general rule to tell when to use to and when to use for? And my first thought was, no, there is no general rule, because we use to for many things and we use for many things. But then Eduardo suggested this context. I will do something to you. I will do something for you. What is the difference? In English, there is a big difference between these two. If you are going to do something to me, I am the direct object of your action. And often it is something bad. What are you going to do to me? You're afraid they're going to hurt you, usually. It can also be neutral, but usually it's unpleasant if they do something to you. But if they do something for you, you are the indirect object, in a sense. They are doing an action that you want done. They are performing a service for you. And it's usually a good thing. You would never say, I am doing something for you, if it was bad. Never. You want people to do things for you. You do not want them to do them to you. Okay? But these prepositions are used in many other ways as well. And generally speaking, there is no rule on prepositions. You just have to memorize and also get a feel by usage. By the way, if you see questions, I'm not reading.
Okay.
Okay. The second question came from the same student. And it's a question I don't really know the answer to, but we can talk about the issue. The student asked about a sentence that is in the text on page 27 at the very top. It begins at the bottom of 26 and goes into the top of 27. The sentence says, their retaining their value depends on the continuing fact of such recognition, or does it? Now the student pointed out that or does it means it doesn't. It does not. Or does it means it doesn't. So why didn't he say it doesn't? Why didn't he say or does it not? Well, I guess there's not really a one-to-one correspondence with something in Portuguese on this, but when we ask ourselves a question, actually, or does it, does not mean it doesn't. It means maybe it doesn't. Maybe. It doesn't. It means let us reconsider. Let us reconsider. It calls into question. This is a phrase I used last week, and I wasn't sure if you understood this. It calls into question what came before. It says, was this true? Does it mean what it said? So it is asking a question, and the question it's asking is this. Does their retaining their value depend on the continuing fact of such recognition? So we never would say, well, actually we could say, doesn't it depend on continuing its recognition? If it would mean something different though. Yeah. If I say, does he want to come? It has a different feel than if I said, doesn't he want to come? Now, strictly and literally, they mean the same thing. They are asking the question if the person wants to come. But the emotional overtone is different. With this one, it is neutral. Does he want to come? You can answer yes or no equally. It calls into question merely his desire. Does he want to or doesn't he? It's equal. But doesn't he want to come has a connotation of he should want to come. He needs to come. He is coming. Why is he standing there? Doesn't he want to come? The answer to this one must be yes, of course. He wants to come. If the answer is not this, you must explain. Why not? You must offer apology. Doesn't he want to come? Well, no, he is very sorry, but his stomach is upset and he needs to go home. Oh, okay, he is excused. So when the author says, their retaining their value depends on the continuing fact of such recognition. If he said, doesn't it? That would push in the direction of it does. It would say it does. It would not merely call into question. It would imply, yes, of course, the retaining their value depends on continuing recognition. So I think maybe that's why he didn't say, doesn't it? Because doesn't it influences the answer. Okay. Let's go back and review a little bit of what we went over last week, because what we have to do this week is very closely connected, and we need to get a running start. So let me erase the board. Okay, I wonder if that'll work better. All right, that might be a little better. Okay. All right. Last week, we were on page 26. And we began with the paragraph that begins, I criticize Andreski gratefully. Levis was pointing out the week before that Andreski was too narrow and himself did not understand the dangers that were threatening the entire culture. But last week, in the paragraph we studied, Levis was turning over and saying, really, I appreciate Andreski. Andreski is our ally. And then he was commenting on Andreski's line, true insights are cumulative and retain their value regardless of what happens to their discoverers. And later he said it recalls Daniel Noyes, who is a character in Little Dorrit, in his reply to Arthur Clenham, who is urging him to give up his battle with the bureaucracy. And the statement was, the thing is as true as ever it was. So it's talking about scientific truths. Scientific truths are true, even if mankind does not believe in them. The world is round, even if mankind believes it is flat. Okay? This is the spirit of science. The spirit of science is to inquire into what is objectively true in the natural world, to exhibit and show forth that truth, to test it and prove it, and to learn more about the laws that govern nature through scientific inquiry and through clear, logical thinking. This is the spirit of science. And he says, science is, we don't really think science is being threatened by the mass media's operation to cretinize or make stupid the population. Okay, so we come to a sentence that is important for our study today. It is on page 26, beginning with the words, so, while science goes on. So, while science goes on, the ideal of disinterested, clear thinking may remain potent in some fields where, as in that which Andreski describes as his own, the rigors of exact science, being impossible, don't apply. We studied this sentence last week, and I want to point out the part about the ideal of disinterested, clear thinking. This will become important in our passage today. I'd like to speak for just a moment about what the word disinterested means. Disinterested is a very funny word a very unusual word in its history in the English language. We have two words that I'd like to bring forth. Disinterested and uninterested. Uninterested. Now, the interesting thing about these two words is that back in history a long time ago, disinterested meant impartial. Is that right? I wrote this down actually. Let me make sure I'm getting it right. Actually, no. Disinterested meant uninterested. It meant indifferent, not interested. Early on, disinterested meant not intellectually sorry, I'm writing small, not intellectually involved. In other words, it doesn't pique your interest. It doesn't draw your imagination. That is what disinterested used to mean a long time ago. And a long time ago, uninterested meant impartial. For instance, you would say, the criminal must be tried by a jury of uninterested men. You could not be the judge in a case if you were interested. If you had to be an uninterested judge. However, in recent years, the words have switched, and now disinterested means impartial, unbiased, no prejudice, honest and fair. And uninterested means not involved or bored. Just not interested at all. So the two words have switched meanings. And now disinterested usually means impartial, and uninterested usually means that you're just not interested in it. Although it is still possible to use them interchangeably. Okay? So it's a tricky word in English. If ever you have to use it, you might need to define your terms. Although context differentiates these. Okay, so we are looking for the ideal of disinterested thought, impartial, unbiased, not prejudiced, honest, and fair. That ideal. And it says, that ideal will last as long as scientific inquiry lasts. That's what they say. Okay. All right. Okay. So, then it went on, and Levis said, we can't help asking, which means we must ask. We are driven to notice. We can't help asking, in what way true insights can be cumulative unless in a general recognition within a professional community that the truths in question have been definitively established and can be safely built upon. So, we are not talking about scientifically proven realities like gravity or the earth being round. We are talking about insights which exist in a discipline that is not an exact science. So these insights cannot be proven in the same way that a scientific fact can be proven. So the question is, how can these insights retain their value, hold on to their value, unless they are existing in a community of professionals that endorse them? Because Andreski is suggesting that these insights will retain their value regardless of what happens to their discoverers. If the person who discovered a sociological insight is cast out and called a heretic and disbarred or fired from his professorship, is his insight still going to be established as definitively true so that more sociologists can build upon it? Levis questions this and says, how can these insights be considered cumulative in the sense that one can be built on the next, if not in a community that recognizes them? Now we get to the last sentence from last week. They're retaining their value, the insights retaining their value, depends on the continuing fact of such recognition by the professionals. Or does it? Okay, so the sentence that we actually didn't study last week. Value, actually, is a very important word, and therefore, in the nature of the case, insidiously difficult for thought. Okay, let's consider the definition of the word value. Value. The sentence says they are retaining their value. So it is using value as a noun. And as a noun, value means worth. Worth. What is it worth? Is a diamond worth, $1,000? Is a pen worth 60 cents? What is the value? Now, Levis says it's an important word. I say it's an ambiguous word. There are two kinds of value. There is intrinsic value and then there is ascribed value. When you look very closely, even these are very closely connected. Because what has intrinsic value? Does gold have intrinsic value? In American history, when we first discovered oil on our land, it was considered to be a problem. an inconvenience, a messy, unproductive substance. And then in the beginning, they discovered they could get the kerosene off the top, but they threw most of the oil away. It wasn't till later that they discovered that oil could be burned as fuel. And now it is considered black gold. Now oil is valuable. Now it had intrinsic value all along. It hasn't changed. But the ascribed value was 0 when we first discovered it, and it has gone up since we discovered how to use it. So, these insights, it says their retaining their value depends on the continuing fact of their recognition by professionals. Now, value is ambiguous because if the insights are true, then they have intrinsic value, regardless of what anyone thinks of them. But if the professionals do not recognize them as being correct and true, then they cannot become part of a cumulative body of knowledge that future scientists can build upon. So, value is an important word here and needs to be clarified. Also, it says here, in the nature of the case, insidiously difficult for thought. The question in my mind is, what kind of thought has value? What kind of thought has value? Does leftist political thought have value? Leftist? Or do the conservative thoughts of the right have more value? Does emotional and poetic thought have value? Does the idea, for example, that women are equal to men, women's rights, does that thought have value? We'll call it civil rights. What kind of thought has value? We are looking for the ideal of clear, disinterested thought. The ideal, that's what we are shooting for, of clear, disinterested, there's that word, thought. I contend that any thought which is true, which represents reality as it really is, any thought like that has intrinsic value. It's true as it ever was. It's true regardless of what anybody thinks. But when we are talking about thoughts that have value within a discipline, the question of disinterestedness comes in. Some people who are leftists believe the thoughts on the left have value and the thoughts on the right do not. But the conservatives would say those thoughts have value and these do not. So in terms of ascribed value, it's very hard to say what kind of thought has value when you are not dealing in an exact science, especially if you are trying to exclude any bias or prejudice. So when it comes to thought, how do you determine value? It's a very good question. Levis goes on in the next paragraph. He says, I'll read the last sentence of the previous and then go on. Value, actually, is a very important word, and therefore, in the nature of the case, insidiously difficult for thought. It has a close association with the word standard, itself very tricky, especially in relation to the assumptions going with a self-commitment to logic, clear thinking, and disinterestedness. Okay, standards. I looked up the word standard in the dictionary, and there were 28 different definitions for the noun form and more for other grammatical types. You want to look at this? Maybe there's something wrong with the sound quality.
No, it's okay. They're commenting that it got better.
Oh, it got better. Good. Okay. 28 different definitions of the word standards. And most of them were what I would consider content-free. Content-free. Just like the word values. In American politics, people don't like to talk about virtue or specific virtues, such as honesty, courage, patriotism, self-denial, etc., humility. Those are taboo concepts. Instead, we use content-free words like standards and values. Standards and values are the new morals and ethics. Standards, in the dictionary, it basically defined it as whatever a person values. Okay? The standard is the model that other products, other actions try to mimic. The standard is whatever is correct, whatever is acceptable is considered the standard. And in morals and ethics, standards are just generic, whatever a culture deems appropriate. We have standards. We eat with a fork. We do not put our elbow on the table. We have standards. We take off our hat when we are in the house. We stand when a lady enters. We have standards. We don't use certain words, and we do use other words. We have standards. So standards is sort of like a content-free form of morals or ethics. Okay? And values is the same. In American politics, we have what we call the values voter. Values voter. This is the block of people that will not vote for you if you are pro-abortion or pro-homosexual rights or something like that. People who care about morals and ethics, people who are religious, are lumped into the values voter. And the politician has to say, I have values, and speak in terms of values and standards. And then the very innocent and credulous values voter will say, yes, not realizing there is no content. He is only using words that you can invest with any content you want. So one person believes that he will vote against abortion. Another believes that he will vote in favor of something, I don't know, and it's never clear. So values and standards both have to do with ethical choices. All right, and so value is an important word, and therefore, in the nature of the case, insidiously difficult for thought. What kind of a thought has value? It has a close association with the word standard itself, very tricky, because it doesn't actually mean much. Especially in relation to the assumptions going with a self-commitment to logic, clear thinking, and disinterestedness. The way standards and values work, they have very little to do with logic, clear thinking, or disinterestedness. Andreski himself introduces the word in a brief paragraph, coming a few lines before the opening of that which I have quoted. So now we get another quote from Andreski, which came a little sooner in the book, before the quote we already read, and he will introduce his concept of standards. Okay, I'll read it to you, the quote by Andreski. Whether exhortation helps much may seriously be doubted, for despite centuries of inveighing against stealing and cheating, these misdemeanors do not appear to be less common now than at the time of Jesus Christ. On the other hand, it is difficult to envisage how any standards whatsoever can continue to exist without some people taking upon themselves the task of affirming them and preaching against vice. Okay, let me look at a little bit of vocabulary in this section first before we go on. And Eduardo, if you think of any questions that I haven't addressed, point it out,
Okay.
please. Because I didn't have anyone telling me which vocabulary to look for. Okay. Whether exhortation helps much may seriously be doubted. Okay, exhortation means calling people to a good behavior, saying, come, do the right thing. Okay, pointing out the right thing and saying, do it. John the Baptist exhorted the multitude to repent and believe. Exhortation is to ask people powerfully to come and do good. So, whether exhortation helps much may seriously be doubted. When you doubt something, you think it probably doesn't help much. And help what? Well, help the situation of his former quote that we already read, where you have supposedly scientific people just pulling ideas out of the air with no support, and all the underlings agreeing just because their paycheck depends upon it. So we want that to stop. So should we exhort people to stop? Well, it probably won't help much. Because, for in this context means because, despite centuries of inveighing against stealing and cheating, despite means in spite of, it means this thing happened, which would lead you to think that a conclusion would occur, but that conclusion did not occur. Something else happened. So, despite centuries of inveighing against, inveight means strongly condemning stealing and cheating. Okay, so despite centuries of strong condemnation of stealing and cheating, these misdemeanors or these sins, these misbehaviors, these bad things, do not appear to be less common. They are happening just as much as ever. They are common now. They are not less common now than at the time of Jesus Christ. So they are not less common, means they are common now. Double negatives in English make a positive. So they are very common now, in spite of centuries of strong condemnation. So exhortation probably isn't going to help with the problem of today with the bad scientists. Okay. These misdemeanors do not appear to be less common now than at the time of Jesus Christ. So we say here, exhortation doesn't help. On the other hand, which means, okay, now we're going to a different conclusion. On the other hand, it is difficult to envisage. That means difficult to see, difficult to imagine. We cannot imagine how any standards whatsoever can continue to exist without some people taking upon themselves the task of affirming them and preaching against vice. Okay, so on the one hand, exhortation will not help. On the other hand, we'll have no standards whatsoever if we don't preach.
Whatsoever.
Whatsoever. Whatsoever. We will have no standards whatsoever. Whatsoever means none at all, absolute zero. It gives emphasis to the no. It emphasizes the no. It's used very much in emotional argument. We will have nothing whatsoever if we do thus and such. It gives a punch to the absoluteness of none at all. Okay? So the sense of this is that on the one hand, we have been preaching and exhorting for centuries, and people are still stealing and cheating. But on the other hand, if we don't preach, well, there will be no restraint at all. Chaos will ensue. It is difficult to envisage how any standards whatsoever can continue to exist without some people taking upon themselves. What does that mean, taking upon themselves? Taking upon themselves. if you take something on yourself, that means you are appointing yourself to a position of authority that you were not given through legitimate authority. For example, if I take upon myself the obligation to enforce the law, I become a vigilante. Vigilante. I don't know if I'm spelling this right. That may be spelled wrong. This is a person who goes out with a gun to shoot criminals. A person who goes to an abortion clinic and kills the doctor and nurses is a vigilante. They have taken upon themselves the authority to execute justice upon the person who they think is doing wrong. So if a person takes upon themselves the task of preaching against vice, they're acting as though they were the priest or the minister of the church, but maybe they are not ordained. They're not ordained, but they take upon themselves the position of being the moralist. Okay, so it says, we will have no standards at all if some people don't take upon themselves the task of affirming the standards and preaching them. So it sounds like he is excusing himself for the unpleasant character he has taken of a know-it-all busybody who is criticizing the world. He has taken upon himself the role of critic of his entire discipline. But he's saying some people have to do it. So he's doing it. And he is taking on himself the task of affirming the standards and preaching against vice. Now remember, this entire quote was included by Levis merely to explicate and explain his usage of the word value and his usage of the word standard. Okay, Levis wants to look at what Andreski really means by values and standards. And Levis ultimately probably wants to consider the absolute meaning of values and standards when it comes to education and thought. So let's read on. The attitude of that last sentence is wholly applaudable. It is the attitude conveyed and made potent by the book. In feeling, I think I'll read most of the paragraph here, just to get a larger feel, and then we'll go back and go sentence by sentence. In feeling and judging, one notes that exhortation in the first sentence is, as Andreski uses it, an ambiguous word. Another ambiguous word for us. It might be commented that preaching in the last is too. But preaching is yoked with affirming. And Andreski's way of affirming is what may reasonably be called concrete presentation accompanied by the relevant clear discourse. One judges him to be secure against any charge of unfair selectiveness or improperly biased commentary. What he does is to expose the vice, having evoked the standard by which it is vice. Exhortation, hardly of itself, implies that method. If we ask why he uses such a word, giving it the emphasis of a supporting sentence, the answer seems to be that it expresses an uneasy sense of there being something like an inconsistency haunting his thought. So Levis is suggesting that Andreski is inconsistent in his thinking. This is a criticism in the first sense of last week, a true criticism. It goes along with his criticism that Andreski doesn't really understand the full magnitude of the danger coming upon his own discipline and the civilization at large. Okay, let's make sure we understand the beginning of the paragraph before we go into the main idea of the paragraph. Okay, the attitude of that last sentence is wholly applaudable. Okay, so let's remember the last sentence. It was, on the other hand, it is difficult to envisage how any standards whatsoever can continue to exist without some people taking upon themselves the task of affirming them and preaching against vice. So Levis agrees that Andreski is justified in taking upon himself the role of prophet to the age, prophet to his discipline. Levis is not critical of Andreski, saying, Andreski, you had no right to take upon yourself this role. It's not your business. Levis is not saying that. Levis is saying, you're right, both in your thinking and in your actions. Good. Go for it. It's wholly applaudable. And he goes on to say, it is the attitude conveyed and made potent by the book, meaning his book, Social Sciences as Sorcery. And the attitude is the attitude of holding forth the standards and exhorting people to keep to them. Okay. In feeling and judging so, what that means is Levis feels and judges that the spirit of the book, the attitude conveyed in the book, is this attitude of preaching against vice. So in feeling that that is the spirit of the book, one notes that exhortation in the first sentence is, as Andreski uses it, an ambiguous word. It might be commented that preaching in the last is too. But preaching is yoked with affirming, and Andreski's way of affirming is what may reasonably be called concrete presentation, accompanied by the relevant, clear discourse. One judges him to be secure against any charge of unfair selectiveness or improperly biased commentary. Okay. Exhortation. Well, let me go on one more sentence. What he does is to expose the vice, having evoked the standard by which it is vice. Exhortation hardly of itself implies that method. If we ask why he uses such a word, giving it the emphasis of a supporting sentence, the answer seems to be that it expresses an uneasy sense of there being something like an inconsistency haunting his thought. Okay, I want to speak about this concept as a whole, rather than go into sentence by sentence, word by word. I want to construct a picture. Okay, two different worlds. In science, we have hard facts. And we have the scientific method. The scientific method seeks to uncover and exhibit truth based on proofs. I'm going to say proven, and established by clear, valid, logical thought. In religion and morality and ethics, I'll just say religion to save space, but we're talking morality and ethics. We do not start with concrete facts. We start with revelation. We would not necessarily know what is good and what is bad apart from divine revelation. It is not rooted in nature or something that can be discovered by the scientific method, morality and ethics. That sort of thing is revealed, morality and ethics. Once a standard has been revealed by God, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, honor thy father and thy mother, keep holy the Sabbath day. I, the Lord, am your God. You shall have no other gods besides me. Once these things are revealed, then persons are exhorted to follow these laws against their nature. Against natural inclination. Now, on this side, we have scientific laws. These are laws. We'll call it laws. And in fact, everything operates by these laws of nature, which can be observed. You don't have to exhort anyone to obey the laws of nature. The cosmos naturally follows these laws. We observe them. They are not prescribed by someone. They are simply observed. Okay, there is a fundamental difference between laws of nature and standards which someone has to be exhorted to adhere to against natural inclination. So, when Andreski is putting forth the idea that sociology is scientific and we must have clear thinking in order to put forth the laws, to exhibit the laws. But he uses words like exhort and preach and vice. There's an inconsistency in his thought. Levis says that Andreski's method is to exhibit concrete presentation accompanied by relevant, clear discourse. He exposes a vice having first evoked the standard by which it is vice. So he is actually acting, really in reality, he is behaving more like a prophet who invokes a standard and then calls people to adhere to it, than like a scientist who is saying, look, truth stands for itself, no matter what people think of it. So, the idea of value, what kind of thought has value, and the idea of standards, what kind of standards are there? Bears some consideration in light of the case that Andreski is putting of sociology and for our study of education in the culture at large. Are we invoking more of a scientific approach to standards, or are we invoking more of a moral approach, like you have to be honest, intellectual honesty is good, is the left better or the right? Which thought has value? It's questions to be asked. Okay, let us read on a little bit. Let me reread this paragraph just to make sure I haven't missed anything. And if you have any questions, you can...
Does yoked mean?
Yoked?
Yeah.
Let's see. The word yoked in the sentence, preaching is yoked with affirming. It means connected. And in this sense, the word preaching is explained by the word affirming. If preaching was ambiguous, it is disambiguated by the word affirming. Preaching means to affirm in this context. And I don't speak Portuguese, so I don't know if there are questions. But I'm going to read the paragraph. The attitude of that last sentence is wholly applaudable. It is the attitude conveyed and made potent by the book, that he is this. He's the moralist. In feeling and judging it so, one notes that exhortation in the first sentence is, as Andreski uses it, an ambiguous word. It might be commented that preaching in the last is too. But preaching is yoked with affirming, and Andreski's way of affirming is what may reasonably be called concrete presentation. That would be more over on this side. Concrete presentation accompanied by relevant, clear discourse. That's here. Observing phenomena of nature and establishing the laws of nature through clear, valid, logical thought and discourse. Always undergirded by observation of the facts of nature. One judges him to be secure against any charge of unfair selectiveness or improperly biased commentary. That means nobody is going to get the idea that Andreski is talking about a small minority of the people in his discipline. It's clear that the problems he points out are pervasive. They are everywhere. He is being unbiased and disinterested in his exhibition of the problem. What he does is to expose the vice, having first, beforehand, evoked the standard by which it is vice. Is emphasized. so that it emphasizes that most people don't think this is vice at all, but it is vice. Even though no one would see it that way, it is vice. So it needs an emphasis. Exhortation, hardly of itself, implies that method. See, the method of exhortation is not simply to reveal something which is obvious and then interact on it. That's not the method of religion. If we ask why he uses such a word, giving it the emphasis of a supporting sentence, the answer seems to be that it expresses an uneasy sense of there being something like an inconsistency haunting his thought. Why does he use the word haunting? Haunting implies that, for one thing, it implies that it's in many places at once and not localized. And it also implies that it's not easy to pin down. You can't see it clearly. You get an uneasy sense, a feeling that maybe there's a ghost here. You know, there's something not quite right, something supernatural. That's haunting. It's haunting his book, that maybe there's an inconsistency in his thought between him thinking of himself as a scientist, but really he's a moralist. There are grounds for such a sense. We have 15 minutes. Should we go on to the next paragraph, Edward?
I think we can go.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll go on 15 more minutes. Okay. We can at least start this paragraph. There are grounds for such a sense. They lend themselves best to consideration in Andreski's chapter 8, Evasion in the Guise of Objectivity. They don't seriously impair the book for Andreski's avowed purpose, but in a way that can be profitably taken as a challenge, they entail issues in relation to values and standards about which anyone concerned to enforce the contention that English should stand for a discipline of thought needs to be clear in his mind, articulate and tactically ready. Andreski's chapter opens. The distinction between a judgment of fact and a judgment of value has become one of the cornerstones of philosophy ever since Hume wrote his famous statement that reason is and must always remain the slave of the passions. Though beset by the difficulties of application, due above all to the shading off of concepts into one another, this distinction underlies the ideal of objectivity. Olavo doesn't have a lot of respect for Hume. Hume gives the idea that value is subjective and that fact is objective. Olavo does not separate the two. He believes and teaches that we cannot separate facts and values. They are inextricably bound together in our perception of reality. As we apprehend the facts, we also apprehend the values. Olavo also says that Hume denies the principle of reason itself. I don't claim to understand the philosophy that Olavo brings to this. And when he and I discussed this passage, it wasn't completely clear to me how he interwove the philosophy. So I'm going to just try to explicate what Levis seems to be saying on the surface. There are grounds for such a sense. What sense? The sense that Andreski is haunted by inconsistency of thought. Okay. Grounds means there is a reason to believe it. There is some evidence. They lend themselves best to consideration in Andreski's chapter 8. They refers to the grounds. The grounds lend themselves best to consideration. In other words, if you read chapter 8, you will be able to consider best this idea of inconsistency in Andreski. Chapter 8, entitled Evasion in the Guise of Objectivity. They don't seriously impair the book for Andreski's avowed purpose, but they entail issues in relation to values and standards about which anyone needs to be clear in his mind. Okay, this is one of those sentences where we have to exclude things in order to perceive the thread. So let's get the thread of this sentence down. I think I'm getting used to Levis's style. It's getting easier to skip stuff. Okay. All right, first of all, they don't seriously impair the book. Impair means undermine it and make it less effective. They don't reduce the value of the book or make the book worthless for Andreski's purposes. These grounds, these criticisms, these inconsistencies, these faults are not so serious that they impair the book for Andreski's purposes, but in a way that can be profitably taken as a challenge. They entail issues. Okay. They don't impair the book. And then we leave something out, but leave something out. They entail issues. In relation to values and standards. In relation to standards and values about which anyone must be clear in his mind. I think that's the thread. This inconsistency of Andreski, this fault in his reasoning, does not impair the book, but it does entail issues concerning standards and values, which we should be clear about in our mind. Okay? So, Levis is trying to get us to see the specific nature of standards and values in a way that is more clear than what Andreski is doing, because Andreski seems to be a bit foggy, a bit inconsistent. Now, what went in to the parts we left out? Okay. They don't seriously impair the book for Andreski's avowed purpose. Now, and when it says avowed purpose, that means the purpose that Andreski says he has with writing the book. Andreski wants to convince his audience that there is a problem in sociological studies in the academic world. And his foggy thinking about standards and values does not undermine his case that there is a problem. His avowed purpose, the purpose he knows that he is writing, is not impaired. Perhaps it does impair the book for our purposes, or for the purposes of a more discerning reader who recognizes the inconsistency. It could undermine the book. But for Andreski's rough and tumble kind of purpose of making a case against the faulty practices in sociology, it's okay. It doesn't impair the book for that purpose. However, and let's see, in a way that can be profitably taken as a challenge, that goes in here, in a way that can be profitably taken as a challenge, what he's saying is, we aspire to be clearer in our thinking than Andreski. We take it as a challenge to not make the same mistake he made. We take it as a challenge to avoid inconsistency, to pin down what we mean by values and standards. We are not going to be content-free. We are going to understand what we mean when we use these words. We are going to specify what we mean. So this is our challenge. Okay? So, in a way that can be profitably taken as a challenge, they entail issues in relation to values and standards. So, it brings up questions that need to be addressed in relation to values and standards, about which anyone concerned to enforce the contention, about which anyone, here we go, what kind of anyone? Anyone who is concerned to enforce the contention, that means to make a case, to argue a case, that English should stand for a discipline of thought, needs to be clear in his mind. So if we believe that language study is key to producing higher order thinking, we need to understand what the standards of education, of expertise in the field really are. And we need to know what kind of a thought has value and what kind of a thought doesn't. Okay? We need to be not only clear in our mind, we need to be articulate and tactically ready. Articulate means we need to be able to clearly say what we mean in our argument for English being a distinctive discipline of thought. We need to be ready to make a good, clear verbal case, and we need to be tactically ready. Tactically ready meaning there is an enemy. This is a war. We are fighting, and we could lose or we could win. And it depends on how we pursue our case. So we need to be tactically ready. We need to be articulate, and we need to be clear in our mind as to what the standards are academically, intellectually, as regards philosophical thought, as regards literary value. We're about out of time, but I want to close with a comment of Olavo's. Andreski says that as long as we have a minority of people who can think clearly, there is hope for humanity. Olavo says that the most serious problem in education today is that people do not have a shared base of imaginative and literary understanding and broad conceptual understanding from which to communicate. He says that before discussing advanced, lofty ideas, the grasp of reality in its larger sense, people must have their imaginations expanded. They must have not only expanded and cultured imagination, they must also have a shared cultural heritage and imaginative heritage from which they can profitably discuss and have discourse. And for that, you need a broad literary background in excellent literature. And so a trained literary imagination, that's what Olavo says. So Andreski says all we have to be able to do is think logically. But Olavo says that, number one, if you don't learn to appreciate language, to speak and to read and to broadly experience literature, first, your brain won't be developed well for logic, and secondly, logic is here, and then the highest type of reasoning is here. So even if you achieve clear logical thinking, you still won't be capable of the highest kind of reasoning. So the trained literary imagination is primary, and it also raises you to the heights. So I think we'll stop here. And if you have any questions, you can send them now. We'll take a 5-minute break. And if there are no questions, we'll come back next week. Oh, there's one more thing. Let me see if everyone's still here. Okay. Homework. It is time for homework. This is it. You have 2 weeks to do this. And I recommend you do it. What I want you to do is, please, write 1 or 2 paragraphs explaining the thread of Levis's argument so far. That means as far as we have gotten. It is not complete. But what have you understood Levis to be saying? 1 or 2 paragraphs. If possible, write in English. It doesn't matter if it's not perfect. It doesn't matter if something's wrong. I am interested to see how well you can write in English. If you cannot write in English, You can mix English and Portuguese, or you can write in Portuguese, because we have people who can translate. I want to know what you have understood, and I want to see your English usage, and I feel that if we do not review the thread of the argument, we will begin to lose track of where Levis is going. So, 2 weeks. I will ask you next week how you're doing, and I will ask you to email it to us in 2 weeks so that I can share some with the class in 2 weeks. So good luck and give it a try. And we'll take a 5-minute break now if you have any questions. I can see some people are coming back. Maybe you were getting a drink. We had one question. And this is something that maybe some of you might want to write back and speak to me on right now in real time. The question was, what don't I understand about Hume that Olavo said? Well, first of all, I am not well trained in the philosophers. So Olavo told me about the philosophies of several philosophers, including Hume and others as well. And I have trouble separating which one said what. I remember, I think Hume was the billiard ball. Did one thing cause another? And I think Hume said that we see one ball hit another, but we do not see the cause. We only see that this one began when this one stopped. Hume says we don't see the cause, but Olavo says we do see the cause. We see that this one hit this one and moved it on. And so I think I remember Olavo saying that if we see a murder, we know it's bad. Or if someone punches you, you feel it and you know it is bad. If someone gives you a gift, you receive and you know at the same moment the value and the fact occur simultaneously in your brain. This is what I remember of Olavo's comments. In the book here, it says, reason is and must always remain the slave of the passions. I was wondering if Hume was saying that we perceive value according to our passions. Value is subjective. If it's good for me, I think it is good, even if it's bad for you. My reason is I cannot be objective. I can only reason according to my reaction. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure I understand the connection between what Hume is saying, what Olavo is saying, and what this book is talking about. So, does anybody have any comments about that before we stop?
It seems that both Olavo and Levis think that, well, the fact that Andreski relies on Hume's distinction between judgments of fact and of value is a weakness of Andreski. It seems that Levis agrees perfectly with Olavo on this point. That's not the right way to treat objectivity. This distinction, well, I think we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves, but Levis will go thoroughly explaining why he thinks that that's not the case, that Hume is a problem for Andreski and for our culture and for, well, English as a discipline of thought. And, well, Olavo says other things, but they both perfectly agree, I think.
Were you able to hear what Eduardo just said, or should I repeat it for you? Meanwhile, I'll write the homework on the board again. Okay, let's see. Did anyone say anything?
Yes, people were asking if you could
Okay.
explain.
All right, let me
what
try
you
to
got.
explain what Eduardo said. He said that Levis seems to agree with Olavo that Hume is a problem for our culture, for English as a discipline of thought, that Hume's approach is not the correct way to perceive objectively, to perceive reality. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that we should wait and see if Levis explains further his attitude. But Eduardo believes that that Levis is critical of Hume and feels that Hume has a problem. So we'll see if Levis continues to speak in that vein or not. Okay, I think we are done for today. No more questions? We'll see you next week.